Hello, friends. This lecture is about the Beidelman article that's called The Kaguru House. It's from 1972, so way back when I was a baby. And the thing to know about Beidelman is that he is an anthropologist who worked in Tanzania in the 60s and the 70s, and he has a whole lot of articles, books, essays. Um, and one of the things that he was really influenced by was the theoretical school that's known as structuralism. So, in your theory class, when you take anthropological theory, we'll talk about what structuralism is. But one of the things that the structuralists in anthropology were really keen to do was to talk about how the world works in such a way that there are oppositional forces like binaries. So the idea, if you think about in part what influenced structuralists, they were writing and thinking about theory during a period of time when computer technology was really on the rise. And so, you know how computers talk to themselves, they have this idea about zeros and ones, these binaries that they use. I don't really understand how that works, to be quite honest, but um, there was also a lot of linguistic work happening here. You've probably talked about this in your linguistic anthropology class, especially pioneered by a guy called Saussure. And he had this idea that in the human brain, the way that we make meaning is by thinking about a concept, let's say the concept good, and then the thing that gives good meaning is that we have a similar opposing concept, like the concept of bad. Now, you might say to yourself, isn't that just a Western idea? Well, probably. This is the reason that a lot of structuralism has fallen out of favor, and there, it's just one theory among many theories for explaining culture. But um, Beidelman, who wrote this article, is very interested in symbolism and also interested in how the symbols have a meaning to people that goes real deep. So a symbol is not just something that um, appears or exists, but rather it signals to the viewer some kind of substantive meaning that the person's culture allows them to contextualize. So, in other words, if you're just like walking through your day and you see a symbol, like let's say in this case, you see a house, the way that that house is constructed and the various pieces of that house, according to Beidelman, resonate with the viewer, assuming that that person has the cultural context. And in this case, he's talking about kaguru houses. So for the kaguru person viewing a house, that house is replete with symbols that they have the context to decode. That's kind of how structuralism works. So in this article, we're going to work through it because he gives us a lot of really rich data, and he also gives us some historical details. And so we're going to take a look at how the kaguru house is simultaneously a house that people live in, but also for Beidelman, and he would argue also for the kaguru, a set of symbols that organize the cosmology of their world. So that there are pieces of these houses, things like hearths, things like center poles, that are not only hearths and center poles, but also indicate this whole series of ideas that reflect gender and cosmology and good and bad and interiority and exteriority and belonging and exclusion. So let's dive right in and take a look at this article and see if you're persuaded. uh, Always with these articles, it's like, does the author do what the author sets out to do? Like I said, this article comes to us from 1972, and by the time Beidelman wrote this article, he was a very seasoned ethnographer. He had been in Tanzania since the 50s, probably, and he is working in kaguru settlements, which are here in what would we call this? East Central Tanzania. This is where I lived when I did my sabbatical. Uh, the biggest city there is a place called Morogoro, and it's about, I would say, by car, it's about 3 or 4 hours from Dar es Salaam, which is the capital of Tanzania. So this is what the landscape looks like. These are the Uluguru Mountains, and so Mm, they're pretty high, but they're not like Himalaya high. You know what I mean? There, there is an element of cloud forest here. They're at a high enough of elevation that there are parts of the Uluguru Mountains where there's always like this kind of fine, misty um, kind of environmental condition, which means that there's high humidity, but the temperatures are relatively mild because of the elevation. And the other thing about elevation is that it deters a lot of insects. So the people who live here are agriculturalists. They grow a wide variety of um, crops that they consume. In recent years, they've also been growing sisal, which is a fiber that if you ever get like one of those cheap ass Easter baskets that's not made of plastic, but has like some kind of oh, like, people at Hobby Lobby love sisal. It's like this stuff that they use to make baskets and wall hangings and things like that. A fiber. They also have recently been well, there's been a lot of efforts to get them hooked on growing tobacco as a cash crop to export. So um, there's a lot of agricultural land that formerly has belonged to families or lineages that have um, been converted to tobacco farms. So there's quite a lot of effort here to get the people exporting crops. There's a lot more I could say about that. It's part of a national push. It's called Kilimo Kwanzaa, and it's this effort to get Tanzanians involved in like a global economy by exporting agricultural things. Here's another look at what the landscape looks like. I think this is my photograph of outside of Morogoro. But you can see that there's a lot of elevation change. It's quite rugged, quite hilly, with a lot of agricultural features, trees, shrubs, grasses, but not really rainforest. And hey, the other thing to note about this region is that there is also a lot of livestock in the area. So the people don't just grow foods, but they also typically keep, well, cows are the high prestige item, but they also sometimes keep like goats and sheep and things of that nature. Today, most Kaguru people have been converted to Christianity. There are not a lot of Muslims living in this part of Tanzania. They also sometimes have syncretic beliefs that reach back into the past. And the kind of houses that Bettelman is talking about in this article, you can still see them today, but a lot of the people, a lot of Kaguru people now live in big cities like Morogoro, but some of them still live in hamlets or villages up here in the hills, and they, especially sometimes during the harvesting season, will just, take a vacation, or like whole families or lineages will like go up there into the hills to what's called a shamba. A shamba means farm in Swahili. And will, they'll just like work real intensively on their gardening and their farm to bring in a crop. Um, Oh, also, some folks have started growing strawberries recently, and that was a nice discovery for me, was when people were growing strawberries. They have the right kind of climate for it. This is what some of the fields look like. So you can see there that kind of I'm sorry, cloud foresty kind of um, landscape, and the terracing that you have to do. So if you're growing crops and you live on a slope, if you just plant your stuff, let's say you clear the land and then you just plant your stuff and then you just wait for the rains to come, uh, likelihood is pretty high that everything's just going to like flow on down and get eroded. So Kaguru people figured out, centuries ago, that they could dig these steps or terraces into the landscape. And, we see terraces, we see terraced farming techniques all over the world. We see them in South America, we see it in Asia. So it's a pretty standard way of conserving your soil. That said, there are still some problems with erosion. One of the things that I really like about the Kaguru farming techniques that I didn't see among the Mande is that they have this really uh, kind of a value on diversified crops. So they're growing a lot of different things in a small plot of land. They're doing essentially what some people call agroforestry, where they make use of the different kinds of vegetation that already exists there, and um, they make use of like places to grow shade plants and places, the under canopy. So they're really making the absolute best use of the land that they have, and they're growing things like bananas and mangoes and papayas in the same place that they're growing things like strawberries and grains and legumes. So they're doing a real kind of intense farming in fairly small family plots. So this article by Kaguru is really about the houses that people live in, and also the ways that those houses reflect the values that the culture holds. So the way that, like the idea here is that if you're a Kaguru person and you roll up on some other Kaguru person's household, or house, you can know something about them and about who lives there and about what they value and about their relative wealth and about um, kind of what, like, you could get the pulse of what's going on with this family. And Bettelman's arguing in this article that the house itself, features of the house, are an expression, they're a symbolic expression of the way the culture thinks about space, the use of land, also about society, so who belongs, who's part of this group, and also about humanity. So that gets right to the heart of personhood stuff. What is it to be a person? What is it to be a Kaguru person? What is it to be a Kaguru person who's part of a community? Let's define a term that I know you've heard me use in this class before, and Cliggett talks a lot about this in Grains from Grass, but let's review what we mean by a household. This is going to be a group of people who are living in uh, a dwelling and who share their expenses. So sometimes when we talk about a household, we're talking about just a few people. But more commonly in Africa, when we talk about a household, we're talking about a lot of people. We're talking about people who are related either by blood or through marriage or through some kind of metaphor of kinship. We use the household in anthropology to talk about uh, economic systems and also to talk about political systems because the household itself is comprised of a group of people who are, at least according to that culture, kind of, I'm going to use this word in quotes, naturally assumed to live together. So it could include a man and his many wives and all of their children. It could include brothers and sisters and all of their children. It could include elderly people and their children and their grandchildren. So the way that a household looks culturally becomes very important to the anthropologist for trying to understand how the culture reckons belonging, identity, personhood. And I know we've already talked about a lot of this in this class. The other things to remember about households is that households are not homogeneous. That is not to say that every single person in the household has the same rights, or every person in the household has the same obligations, or everybody in the household has the same responsibilities. Instead, we note that there are differences in status and wealth within the household, and that the logic of whatever kind of household we're talking about is going to reaffirm and support those distinctions in status and wealth. So, in some cultures, we might find that older people have more status than younger people. In some cultures, we're going to find men have more status than women. In some cultures, we're going to find the first wife having more status than the subsequent wives. In some households, we're going to find that the firstborn child has more status than his or her siblings. Well, typically it's going to be his siblings. But all of this is variable by the household. So in some households, theoretically, it's going to be the first wife who's going to be the most prestigious. But what if that first wife has done something egregious that nobody likes? And so maybe it's the second wife who has higher status. In other words, households are dynamic, they're complicated, they're messy. I mean, they're families. And the other thing that happens within the household is that it's at the household level that people learn what it is to be a person and to be a good person. And so the social relationships that people develop over the course of their life begin within the household. And the kind of social relationships that you have with others is going to depend on who you are relative to them and vice versa. So I know that that's a refresher. So here's what we learn about the kaguru house. First of all, there's a traditional house that's called the misangi. It's the traditional circular house, and it has all these components to it that we learn in their Swahili name. The first thing, though, that's probably most important is the nguso. That's the center pole. The center pole runs up and down the center of the house, and every single misangi is going to have one of these things. It's like the keystone. It's what everything else gets built around. In order to do an nguso, you have to sink that pole into the earth. So the nguso is I guess we could say, the heart of the house. So do you see what I've just done there? I've used a metaphor from my culture to talk about one of the ways that my language references something that's key or that's integral or something that's you can't do without. You can't do without a heart. The heart of the house is the nguso. Now, I want you to hold on to that metaphor because in our culture, we would maybe call it the heart of the house. But in Swahili and among the kaguru, they're actually using a different kind of metaphor for the nguso. You could take a look at the shape and you can guess maybe what that is. The other piece that you can't see in the sideways, but you can see from up above is this one called the H here. It's the mafiga. There's an nguso and there's a mafiga. And every single misangi, every single house is going to have nguso and a mafiga. A mafiga is a hearth. And one of the things that I think we've mentioned before is that very important to the identity of many African women is their capacity to cook, to provide food for others. Cooking, preparing food is a big, important part of sociality, how we interact with other people. And it's a big, important part of identity, how a person, a woman in particular, thinks about herself, because she's a provider of nurturing for others. Um, and when we talked before about personhood and embodiment, I know we've mentioned this. So I want to draw your attention to these two features because D and H, the Nguso and the Mafiga, are really important parts of this house. And then there's other things that are important, like here they've got beds, so people obviously are sleeping in here, and people are also, making love in here, and they're taking care of babies in here, and they're doing all like the really essential parts of being a person inside of their house. Um, there are also places for them to store tools. We see that here, storage spaces. There's also places to, come and go, entryways, exits. So you would enter, and then there's an interior part of the house that is, um, I guess, you could say open to the outside. And then there's an interior part of the house where there's going to be thatch and roofing over the top of it. So here's what the roof looks like. It's pretty detailed. This diagram actually comes from a different, like South America, but it's the same kind of technique that's being used. You've got the center pole, you see here. So this would be the nguso. And then there's straw or thatched materials that are collected and assembled. And usually when they build these roofs, they actually build them on the ground and then they lift them up and put them over onto the house. But let's talk a little bit about what the materials would be to make a misangi. This is what they look like. Oh, actually, no, I'm lying again. This actually is the village where I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and this is the roof that I slept under when I was a Peace Corps volunteer. So, but it's these architectural principles are very similar. So this is the image that I have of this for you. So the first thing that happens is that center pole is put in. You can see this one doesn't have a center pole. This one comes from Mali, not Tanzania. But that center pole is put in, and then the roof is built. You would start down here making thatch, and then basically overlaying each layer of thatch so that you get this appearance. And also it's not really possible for rain or water to get in there. These things are pretty watertight. Like I said, they're built on the ground, and then you're going to need a lot of friends and family to help you lift these things up onto the actual hut. So the other thing that beidelman tells us is, like, where do we get all of the materials for this? Okay, so first, in order to build a misangi, you're going to have to clear the site of any vegetation that's there. So you're clearing out. You're going to need a few people to do that. And then you're going to be collecting all of the materials that you need to build it. You need um, beams, and you also need bark fiber so that you can make these cords that lash things together. Now, one of the things to note is that a lot of these materials are available for only particular times of the year. In other words, the grasses that you need or the bark fiber that you need is only available for harvest at some time of the year, which adds the seasonal element to house building. So house building is going to happen at certain times of the year. The other thing that you're going to need is to collect the grasses that go into the thatch. Again, there's a seasonality to that. And then once you have your center pole, your grasses, your bark fibers, and you've built up the house, the next step is to enclose those sides. And by the way, under here, actually under here is brick. These are mud brick. But for the misangi, do I have a picture of misangi? That would be super useful. There it is. Um, you see, it's actually made with these beams that go straight up and down. And then it's actually kind of woven with softer, more malleable, like fibrous plant parts. So some of it's bark, some of it comes from reeds. These are soaked in water typically to make them more pliable. So you can see that this task of making a home is actually something that, first of all, requires a lot of people. It requires an attention to the seasonality, and it requires multiple materials, each of which is symbolically loaded. So that the grasses have a particular kind of meaning, the kinds of bark that's chosen has a meaning, the kind of beams that are chosen have a meaning. And then once you get this part all assembled and you have a door, then you go ahead and you plaster it. So how do we make plaster? Well, there's lots of different kinds of plaster that people know how to make. The kind that the kaguru make is really kind of more of a clay mud. And so it's going to require the labor of a lot of people to gather the mud, to gather the water necessary to turn it into a plaster kind of consistency. And then what we're told in this article on page 699 is that the final task of plastering the house with earth is a neighborhood affair. This is usually done in one day at a building party. The builder's wife and kinswomen prepare as many gallons of beer as they can afford and then invite the neighboring men and women to work. Local women bring many jars of water to be mixed with the earth. The men dig several large pits, later often used as refuse pits, into which the water is poured and mixed with the piles of earth taken from the pits. A dozen or more men and some women will be busy plastering, singing, and drinking over the day. It's considered both neighborly and enjoyable to take part in such work. So think about that. This is where people live. And the task of making the space is actually a communal activity that involves parts of land, earth, parts of water, and let's not forget this nguso pole, which is in the way that people think, rooting it into the planet, rooting it into the earth, and then sticking up just a little over the top of the house, connecting it to the sky. So the misangi then is a site, it's a point in the landscape that integrates all of these important symbolic elements for the kaguru people. And I like that they're having a party about it too, right? So let's keep on going. Inside, you see the house. So one thing is like the house is actually this interior circle, but then you also build around the outside like a little space where you're going to keep, for example, your livestock, your animals, your chickens, your goats. There's also going to probably be times that people might come and you don't want to bring them right into the space where you sleep or whatever. So you visit with them, you sit, you chat. It's kind of like the idea of having a front porch. There's a space around the Misangi that's considered part of the home, but is also sort of the exterior. So yeah, think about like your patio or your porch or your deck. That's what we're meant to understand here. And then we also know that there are more temporary structures that are built for people to do things like drying grains, or remember when I just mentioned before the people going up to the shamba to do like seasonal agricultural work. So there's a lot of these temporary structures that are known as buyers, and they also sometimes have livestock associated with them. Okay, we also learn about another type of structure, and this is called the tembe. So one of the things that happens is that sometimes households get to be quite large, and the misangi is pretty labor intensive to create. The tembe is a little bit less labor intensive, and it allows for you to house more people. And one of the things that we learn about tembes is that they can be an L shape. See, but as you add more and more space or more and more room for more and more wives or more children or more daughters-in-law or whoever is coming into your household, gradually, sometimes these things turn into actual enclosures. They get to be U-shaped, or they get to actually be closed. So this is a kind of a riff off of a misongi. The tembe is designed to house more people, but they're also, they're quicker to build. You don't need quite so much community support to build one of these things. The other thing is that we learn that tembe uh, structures become much more common during the period of time that the kaguru, at least historically, were worried about slavers coming up into the region. I know we've talked about enslavement and slavery before, but here's another reminder that the continent of Africa has been plagued by this extractive economic institution that takes human beings and turns them into commodities and exports them from their places of origin, from their communities. So Tanzanian um, slave trade really has ended now, but during the period of time from 1500 to 1900, we can see these numbers. Many people were taken from Tanzania and enslaved, and the kaguru were one of the main, almost like, regions where slavers went. Remember, it's only about 3 or 4 hours from the coast. Well, that's by car. It would be a lot longer if you were doing it without a car, but close enough that you can get cargoes of people out. And so one of the things that Beidelman tells us is that this tembe structure, actually, when we start to see it, it's an indicator of social decline. It's an indicator of social chaos, because it's a period of time when people are coming up with a way of enclosing themselves. Just like of several lectures ago now, when we looked at Rosalind Shaw's work in Sierra Leone, the kaguru are very concerned with being kidnapped and taken away, and so they their architecture reflects this, that the tembe structure starts to replace the misongi structure. What we see happening in the misongi or the tembe is an effort to at least have some of the elements that that formerly were in the misongi. So the hearth is still in there, and there's still space for visiting and sleeping, but the actual configuration of space has been transformed. So, one of the things that, uh, so, Beidelman mentions that that's an important thing to keep in mind when we look at kaguru settlements. But he also wants us to talk a little bit about, and now this is returning to Misongi, the very first kind of house that we were talking about. He says, the kaguru settlement may be seen as a moral space, a moral space. That's on page 701. It's an aggregate of moral centers, each focused on the hearth of a particular household. From these extends a gradient of spheres of social and moral responsibility and safety, which ends in the dangerous disorder of the bush or the wilderness. So the house is the safe place. And at the very center of the house, you have this hearth. You also have the nguso, the pole. So let's go ahead and jump into this. I'm just going to continue down with the next. The nearest thing in the Kaguru language to our concept of culture is the Swahili term desturi, with its associations of descent and ancestry. Indeed, Kaguru themselves often speak of how humans may be distinguished from apes, which they concede humans do resemble, but the fact that humans cook their food is the thing that differentiates humans from animals. So the Kaguru are very aware that part of being human is this act of cooking, and cooking takes place at a hearth. Every adult woman has her own hearth. Women are not ever asked to share hearths. That would be like asking, I don't know what, I don't know, I don't know how to even describe what, we don't really have a counterpoint for that. The Kaguru house, this is continuing on page 701, is sometimes seen as a metaphor for the socialization of human relations through marriage. The hearth, with its association of warmth, nutriment, and comfort, is explicitly said to be a woman's domain, and terms for fire, hearthstones, and cooking pots are sometimes used to stand for women and their qualities. But the hearth itself, so this is important, to function properly, must be sheltered within a house so that the center post or the nguso in a circular house or the main posts of a tembe are all supporting the roof in a way that is said to epitomize men, both in the sense that they rise above and protect women, both morally and jurally. So jurally would be by law. Some kagurus say that men should hang their hunting weapons from such posts. The male association with the center posts are further shown by the custom of sometimes tying a bone from a chicken from the key bride wealth payment to the pole, since it is the male of the house who is the key person in negotiating and approving the receipt of such payments. So this is what it looks like in practice. This is the inside of a kisongi and a misongi, I mean. And so you see here that the hearth and the center post, the what do we call them? The mafigo and the nguso are actually sort of like integrated internally. And there we have the requisite chicken. One of the things that Beidelman is saying here is that within the household, there is this continual effort to symbolically reflect the things that people value. And one of the key things that people value are those vital life force energies of male and female that keep contributing to the reproduction of the group and are, signifiers of the productivity of the group. Now, here we are, June of 2021. I'm in Springfield, Missouri. We're in the middle of Pride. And sometimes reading material like this from anthropology, from ethnography, gives us pause because it seems so very binary and it seems so very inflexible in terms of how it codes and demonstrates an understanding about the human body and the sort of reproductive imperative that we find frequently showing up in African cultures. Look, African cultures almost always are unapologetically pro natalist. And what that means is they want more babies every single generation. There's a high emphasis on fertility and a high emphasis on reproduction. But as we have seen, and as we will see in other lectures, for young people, this is kind of breaking down a little bit. There might be something comforting to going to your grandparents' house and seeing this kind of like fundamental, binary, essentialist identity enshrined within the symbols of the house. But increasingly, people don't live this way. Increasingly, people don't choose arranged marriages. Increasingly, people are exploring alternate forms of sexuality that are not pronatalist and are not heteronormative. And so, um, this is probably a good place to call it a day with this article. Um, I'll reference this article in other lectures because Beidelman really puts his finger here at the heart of a lot of African cosmology, and I'm talking traditionally, and African identity construction, and again, I'm talking about traditionally, because what we often see is an effort to unite binaries in the symbol. Here we go. The house represents a conjoining of male and female principles. These are very important to the cosmology of the kaguru. The house is a victory of order. That's a nice way to think about a house, isn't it? It's like a site, it's safe, it's a place where the material substances of the world, of the bush, of the outside are united. They're drawn together and they're given form and shape, and they act in the best interest of the humans. The material substances such as earth and wood and dangerous forces like fire and fertility are productively united. That's what a house does. It unites these forces that exist in the landscape, these forces that exist outside of human culture, and it shapes them so that they act in the best interest of the humans. Now, of course, what's left out of a lot of this article, although I've read a lot of Beidelman, and in this article, he leaves out a lot of the supernatural stuff. I've got a bunch of other articles by Beidelman. I find him very accessible. And maybe I'll upload another one for you. But the humans themselves, they're gathering all of these materials from the landscape, but they're not doing it alone, because guess who else is there? The ancestors. So there's this supernatural energy that is also energizing the construction of the house and the selection of materials and the seasonality and the way in which people come together through sociality to enact construction. Woo, I have used a lot of big words. But do you get me here? The last part of this article talks about rites of passage and times when people are confined to the household. Spoiler alert, it's usually when women have babies. But take a look at some of this material, because the material about what's going on in the house is really rich and might make a good quiz question this week. Yeah, so let's call that a day. And I hope your house is fine today. I do have another slide here. One of the things I did as a Peace Corps volunteer was I made a lot of mud stoves. So when I lived in West Africa, the hearth is always outside of the house in West African society. And in a way, it kind of makes sense. First of all, it's a lot hotter. It's not at elevation. It is the Sahel. So one of the reasons that we made these mud stoves is to conserve firewood. It's a kind of a conservation technique. A traditional hearth is 3 stones. So people will find stones that are kind of like evenly sized, like this would be a good size of a stone. And you get the 3 stones and you set them up and you nestle them so that you can put a pot in the middle. And the idea is that you're building the fire in that area between the stones, which is great, except that you need a lot of firewood because the fire is exposed to wind and different elements. If you enclose it and make a hearth, a mud stove, then your fire can actually burn a lot hotter and it's a lot more efficient. So it's a mud stove I made one time. Please enjoy. All right, friends, have a really good day. Thanks for being here. Thanks for caring about African culture, and I'll talk to you soon.